Okay, let's unpack this. Well, the last decade, pretty much every time we talk about a major AI failure, systemic bias, an outright error, maybe a chatbot that just goes off the rails, the standard response, it's almost automatic from developers, from the public. It's always the same thing. We need better data, more training, smarter algorithms. It always comes back to the tech, the math. But what if? Just what if? That's not the whole picture. What if the real challenge isn't that AI isn't smart enough, technically speaking, that it just haven't been designed to be, well, kind enough? Today, we're doing a deep dive in some really interesting material from Psychology Today. There's this piece, From Code to Compassion, Designing AI with Empathy. And it makes this pretty provocative argument. It suggests that the future success, maybe even the social acceptance of AI, really hinges on designing systems that get human emotion, not just systems that are great at crunching patterns.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is how this source kind of bypasses the usual tech talk, the hardware, the software speeds, and it jumps straight into connecting AI design with these fundamental psychological ideas, things that really govern our well-being as humans. The author is basically saying this empathy thing, it's not just some ethical checkbox you take off at the end. No, it's foundational. It's essential for creating interactions that are, psychologically healthy.
Okay, so foundational. What are the key insights we're going to explore today then?
Right, so we've got three main takeaways driving this conversation. First, and this is crucial, we really need to grasp that putting empathy into AI design isn't a luxury. It's not just a nice-to-have ethical thing. It's psychologically essential for keeping people feeling whole, for preserving our sense of well-being and agency when we interact with these systems. Second, we'll explore how these human-centered AI ideas actually echo some classic principles from humanistic psychology, things like valuing individual experience, dignity, autonomy. It's quite a direct link. And finally, we need to look at the big picture, the ultimate stakes. The argument is that the choices we're making right now about how we build these digital tools, they're basically setting up the emotional and mental health infrastructure for the future. So yeah, it's a conversation about the code, definitely, but also very much about the conscience behind it.
That sets the stage perfectly. So, section one, looking at the real cost of this emotional gap. Because we're moving fast into a world where AI systems, well, they're the gatekeepers, aren't they? They handle medical stuff, hiring, loans, huge life decisions. And like you said, almost always they're designed purely for technical efficiency, for precision. They're transactional.
Transactional is exactly the word.
But when the focus is just on speed and accuracy, that human context often gets stripped away. And the psychological cost, well, it can be huge. Could you maybe break down that example the source uses, the patient portal analogy? Why is just delivering the facts cold so much more damaging than giving the same facts with some context?
The patient portal analogy. It's so powerful because it really shows how the damage happens. Okay, so imagine version one, the cold, purely transactional way. You, the listener, maybe you're checking test results at, 3 in the morning. You've been worried for weeks. And the system, built only for accuracy, gives you the news with what the source calls the warmth of a parking ticket.
Yeah, I can picture that.
Right. The screen just says, abnormal results detected. Schedule follow-up. That's it. No context, no hint of what's next, just this stark anxiety bomb dropped in the middle of the night.
Poof, yeah.
And the psychological damage here, it's not just the bad news itself, it's the way it's delivered. The system treats you like an object, a data point that just switched from normal to abnormal. By being so brief, so callous, it ramps up the anxiety massively. And crucially, it triggers this feeling of complete powerlessness, loss of agency.
That loss of agency, that feels key. Like you're not part of your own health story anymore. You're just being processed.
Exactly. Processed by some unfeeling bureaucracy. Now, flip that. Consider version 2, the empathetic system. It gives the exact same medical fact, but it's framed with an awareness of the human on the other side of the screen. It might say something like, your test results show some areas needing attention. We know seeing this can feel deeply worrying. That's completely normal.
Just acknowledging the feeling. That alone changes things.
It does. And then it continues. Your next steps are clearly laid out below, and your provider will contact you within 4 hours to discuss exactly what this means.
Okay, same information, totally different experience. You feel seen, acknowledged, not just processed. You feel like the system, even with bad news, is kind of on your side.
Precisely. And that's the critical point the authors make. Version 2, the empathetic one. It didn't need some huge AI breakthrough, no complex new algorithm. It just needed the system's design to actually consider the human being's emotional state, their fear, their need for some control in that moment. It's human-centered design, not just fancier math.
Right. So this whole section really sets up the why should we care argument. We're building systems right now that, by chasing pure efficiency, are kind of accidentally creating stress, anxiety, and breaking trust.
Yeah, when systems treat people like case numbers, like cogs in a machine, they ultimately fail.
Yeah.
They fail to build that productive, lasting relationship with users, no matter how accurate they are technically.
Okay, so before we go further, we probably need to tackle the word empathy itself, because as you mentioned, it gets thrown around so much in like corporate jargon, alongside synergy and disruption.
Oh, absolutely. It's been diluted.
Right, it's lost its punch. So if we want to build systems that are genuinely compassionate, we need to strip it back. What does empathy actually mean in a design context?
That's a great point, and the source material is really helpful here. It clarifies that we're mainly talking about cognitive empathy in design, not necessarily affective empathy.
Okay, difference being.
Affective empathy is when you actually feel the other person's emotion, like mirroring their sadness. We don't necessarily need our AI checking medical results to feel sad, right?
Ugh.
What we do need is cognitive empathy. That's the intellectual process. It's about perspective taking.
Ah, okay. Understanding their viewpoint.
Yeah. Exactly. At its most basic level, cognitive empathy just means asking, okay, if I were the person using this system, given how they probably feel right now, what would I need? How would I want to be treated?
It's deliberately stepping into the user's shoes, trying to anticipate their needs, their anxieties, their questions.
That simple act, just asking that question, immediately highlights that contrast we were talking about, feeling processed versus feeling acknowledged. Like, think about getting your content removed from a platform. If it's just a robot message, post removed, violation X, you feel dismissed, right? Like some algorithm just flagged a keyword.
Yep. Totally impersonal. Annoying. Precisely. But what if the system says, even if it's automated, something like, we understand this might be frustrating. We value your contribution. However, based on guideline Y, we had to take action X. If you think this is a mistake, here's how to appeal.
Totally different feeling. It acknowledges you, your effort, your right to disagree.
Right. And that builds trust. Even if you still don't like the outcome, you feel respected. So the source makes it very clear, though, this isn't passive. This kind of design takes real active effort. This is where it gets tricky for design teams, right? How do they actually do this, make it operational?
Yeah, it's not magic. The materials lay out a few key requirements for doing empathetic design properly, and they all demand real organizational effort. Discipline, even. First, you need an active pause, like consciously stopping during design and asking, wait, how would this actually feel if it happened to me? That pause itself disrupts the default rush towards just making it work technically.
Okay, pausing. What else?
Second, designers have to systematically seek out different perspectives. They have to recognize that their own experience, often as, technically savvy, maybe affluent, healthy people, isn't universal. That means actively designing for people with disabilities, for different languages, for users who are often marginalized or overlooked.
And the third point.
Third, the team has to constantly resist the urge to think their own experience is the default or the only one that matters. Just because they haven't run into a specific problem or edge case doesn't mean it isn't a massive, life-altering issue for someone else.
I found that bit in the source, the hardest part nugget, really hit home, especially thinking about startup culture. Empathetic design, it argues, often slows you down, at least initially.
Oh, absolutely.
It means taking extra time for context, designing for those edge cases that represent real people, and maybe having some uncomfortable chats about whose voices aren't in the room, whose experiences aren't in the training data.
That's the real friction, isn't it? That organizational resistance.
Yeah.
Efficiency. That's easy to measure. Milliseconds, clicks, conversions, simple numbers. Empathy, though. It means adding steps, adding complexity. It means having conversations that challenge the quickest, easiest path. A good practical example is using red teams.
Red teams, how does that work?
Well, instead of just testing if the system works, a red team's job is kind of to argue against the user, to actively look for ways the system could be harmful, confusing, psychologically damaging.
So actively trying to break it emotionally, not just technically.
Exactly. If you're only optimizing for speed and scale, that empathetic check looks like a bug, like something slowing you down. But the authors argue really strongly that short-term slowdown. That's the price you pay to avoid huge, trust-destroying failures later on.
Which brings us neatly to Section 3, because that old move fast and break things mentality, maybe it was okay, barely, when the worst thing you could break was like the Facebook poke feature.
Yeah, low stakes. Trivial, really.
But now, these systems are the gatekeepers. Employment, loans, housing, security. When these AI systems break things today, they're not breaking features. They're breaking people's access to basic needs, their financial stability. They're breaking lives.
And we have really concrete, frankly devastating evidence of what happens when that deliberate perspective-taking, that empathy, is missing from the start. Let's look closely at algorithmic bias, specifically in security and identification systems, like the MIT research highlighted.
Right, the facial recognition studies.
Yeah. So MIT researchers looked at major facial recognition systems. What they found was shocking. These systems failed, meaning they misidentified someone or just couldn't see them 35% of the time for Black women.
35%. That's incredibly high for something meant to be reliable.
It's astronomical. And compare that, the failure rate for white men in the same systems, less than 1%.
Wow. Less than 1% versus 35. That's not just a glitch.
It's an indictment, really, of the whole design process. It shows a system that works great for one group, but is fundamentally unreliable, even dangerous for another.
And the source is clear. This isn't usually intentional malice, right? It's about the data.
Exactly. It's often down to the training data. If the system is mostly trained on pictures of white men, it literally doesn't learn how to see other faces accurately. It only knows the patterns it was shown. But the impact of that failure, that's where it gets devastating. A 35% failure rate means Black women are disproportionately stopped, questioned, delayed by these systems. At airports, in stores, by law enforcement. It creates chronic stress, public humiliation, totally justified fear and paranoia, and over time, it systematically disadvantages entire communities, increases surveillance, and just destroys trust in technology that's supposed to be neutral. The system isn't just failing to see them, it's actively working against them.
And it's not just security tech. This pattern shows up elsewhere, proving it's a design philosophy issue. The Amazon hiring algorithm example is another stark case.
Oh, definitely. A classic example.
Amazon built this AI tool to help with recruiting, sift through resumes, but they had to scrap it. Why? Because it systematically discriminated against women.
And why did it do that? Because it learned from the past. It was trained mostly on resumes submitted over 10 years, which were predominantly from men, especially in tech roles.
So the algorithm basically taught itself that male candidates were preferable.
Pretty much. It learned to penalize resumes that even mentioned things like women's chess club captain or implied the applicant was female. It replicated and probably amplified historical biases.
And again, the impact isn't just bad PR for Amazon. It's qualified people, women in this case, being denied opportunities before they even get a foot in the door.
Exactly. Economic hardship, psychological damage, that deep sense of unfairness that the system itself is rigged. It erodes trust not just in Amazon, but in the idea that technology can be a force for opportunity.
And the really crucial connection the source makes again and again is that most of these huge damaging problems, the bias in facial recognition, the hiring discrimination, they were largely preventable.
Yes, that's the key takeaway.
Not by some super complex mathematical fix after the fact, but by better listening right at the beginning. By that empathetic process of asking, whose perspective are we missing? Who could this harm? Way back in the design phase.
It comes back to that deliberate effort, seeking out the voices that weren't initially in the room or in the data set.
Okay, so we've seen the cost of getting it wrong. Let's pivot now. Section 4. What happens when organizations actually get this right? And this means recognizing something fundamental about us humans. We form emotional connections with technology, whether designers intend it or not. We can't help but anthropomorphize.
We absolutely do. It's baked into us. The source uses a great little example. Think about your GPS. When you take a wrong turn and it says in that calm, patient voice, recalculating, how do you feel?
Usually relieved, maybe slightly sheepish, but guided, like it's helping me out.
Right. Now contrast that with, say, an old computer system that suddenly flashes a big, red, all-caps error message that feels like it's yelling at you.
Yeah, totally different. One feels like a partner, the other feels like an accusation.
Exactly. The perceived tone, the intent we read into the technology, shapes our subconscious emotional response. And some companies have really cleverly tapped into this.
Like Duolingo, which the source highlights, they teach languages. They could have just made it purely transactional. Get it wrong, see a red X, lose points. Very efficient.
But they didn't. They chose encouragement, The whole user experience is built around this supportive, almost coaching voice. It says things like, almost, try focusing on the pronunciation next time.
It reframes mistakes.
That completely. Failure becomes a learning step, not a judgment. And the user feels coached, supported, motivated. The result, people stick with it. They keep learning. That perceived kindness drives engagement way more than harsh correction ever could.
Spotify is another interesting one they mentioned, but it feels deeper, more personal.
Yeah, Spotify's personalization is fascinating. The source notes, it doesn't just seem to track what you listen to, but somehow intuits why. They're curated playlists, like Discover Weekly or the ones based on mood. They often don't feel like they were just spat out by an algorithm. They feel
like
go to
it actually gets your weird taste in music, put them together for you.
that feeling of being gotten, being understood by the system.
Oh, that's powerful.
It's maybe the ultimate form of digital acknowledgement. It builds serious loyalty.
Okay, but let me push back a little here. Play devil's advocate. Duolingo, Spotify.
Yeah.
They use this empathy to get massive user retention, engagement, loyalty, which is great for business.
Sure.
But isn't there a risk? This is just really sophisticated emotional manipulation. Are we just dressing up clever customer experience design as genuine ethical compassion to make us feel better about the tech?
That's a really important question, a critical one. And the Psychology Today piece does touch on this. It draws a line between ethical engagement and, well, predatory design or manipulation. And the difference really comes down to the principles of trust, specifically things like transparency and user agency.
Okay, how so?
Well, a system using perceived empathy just to trick you, like a dark pattern making it hard to unsubscribe, or an algorithm designed solely to maximize your screen time, regardless of well-being, that is manipulation. It's hiding its real goal.
Right.
But systems that build real, lasting trust, they tend to follow certain design principles. First, they often acknowledge their own uncertainty. We humans actually distrust systems that pretend to know everything. So if a system says, based on what I know, this might be what you're looking for, but I'm not 100% sure, that feels honest. It builds credibility.
Okay, honesty about limitations. What else?
Second, and this is critical for avoiding that manipulation feeling, perceived fairness and justice. When systems explain their decisions, why was this post removed? Why was my loan application flagged? And crucially, when they provide clear, accessible ways for humans to appeal those decisions, ways that feel like they're actually reviewed, that gives users a sense of agency, of power. They feel empowered, not helpless.
So it's about giving control back to the user, making the process transparent.
Exactly. That's the difference between genuine respect for the user and just clever emotional engineering to keep them hooked.
So the real business case for empathy isn't just about being nice, it's strategic. It's about building that long-term trust.
Precisely. People are much more likely to stick with, recommend, and even forgive occasional mistakes from systems that make them feel understood and respected. That trust foundation is incredibly valuable.
Okay, so if that's the goal, this lasting trust, this human-centered design, we need a practical way to get there. Section 5, a framework. The source offers this really practical set of 3 questions. Guiding principles, really. If design teams ask these before building or tweaking any AI system, it could fundamentally change the outcome.
Yeah, these questions are designed to shift the mindset away from just technical specs towards human impact. The first one is, what does this person actually need right now? And that means digging deeper than just the data points, their age, location, purchase history, whatever. It means thinking about their likely emotional state, their psychological needs in that moment.
So not just what data do they need, but what support or feeling do they need?
Exactly. If they're dealing with an insurance claim system after an accident, they probably need clarity, reassurance, maybe speed. If they're using a mental health chatbot, they need non-judgmental listening, validation. The design has to meet that need.
Okay, makes sense. What's the second question?
The second one hits directly on that psychological toll we talked about earlier. How will this interaction affect their sense of dignity and control? Are we building something that empowers them, gives them clear options, transparency, the ability to step in or override? Or are we designing a black box that just processes them like a number, leaving them feeling powerless? Dignity is key for psychological safety.
Right, dignity and control. And the third question.
The third is the crucial check against the kind of bias we saw with facial recognition in hiring. Who might we be harming accidentally? This forces the team to look beyond the average user, to actively consider the outliers, the edge cases, the communities that probably weren't well represented in the training data, people with disabilities, different language speakers, marginalized groups.
So it forces that broader ethical and sociological view, not just the data science view.
Precisely. It's about anticipating unintended consequences.
These questions feel powerful because they're not deeply technical. As the source says, they just require genuine curiosity about others' experiences. Let's make this concrete. How would this framework apply to something tricky, like, say, an automated system for student loan collections?
Ooh, good example. Debt collection is inherently stressful, often feels low dignity. Okay, let's run it through the questions. Q1. What does the person dealing with this system actually need? Well, they probably need financial clarity, definitely, but also maybe a sense of support, not judgment. Flexible options. So an empathetic system wouldn't lead with aggressive anonymous demands. It might start with something like, we understand managing debt can be tough. Let's explore your options together. The goal is finding stability, not just punishment.
Okay, so focusing on support and options. Then Q2. How does it affect dignity and control?
A cold, non-empathetic system might just force them into rigid payment plans. Take it or leave it, no control. An empathetic system. It might offer a dashboard where they can propose different payment schedules, see the impact of each choice clearly, and easily find a human contact if things get complicated.
So it treats them like a partner in solving the problem, not just a defaulter number.
Exactly. It preserves dignity by giving them agency. And finally, Q3. Who might we harm accidentally? Well, a rigid system could seriously harm someone whose income is variable, like a gig worker, or someone hit with sudden medical bills, situations the standard algorithm might not understand. So an empathetic system needs resilience. It needs to flag unusual payment struggles not just as risk, but as potential hardship cases needing a human review. That flagging, that's the empathetic safety net.
That makes the framework really practical. So if we start asking these questions, the next logical step is changing how we measure success, right? We can't just use the old metrics.
Absolutely. The source argues strongly for moving beyond just clicks, conversions, accuracy percentages. We need new metrics reflecting the human outcome. Like, can we actually measure if people felt heard and respected after interacting with the system? Can we test for psychological safety? Did using this product make them feel secure and supported, or stressed and diminished?
That requires different kinds of testing, more qualitative user research probably.
For sure. Deeper user research, not just simple A/B tests on button colors. We need to actually prove it's possible to optimize for both powerful AI and human compassion. It's not an either.
And there are organizations working on this.
Yes, the authors mention places like Stanford's Human-Centered AI Institute, the Partnership on AI Groups developing the practical tools and frameworks to make this real. They're showing it can be done. Powerful AI and human-centered AI aren't mutually exclusive. They should be the same goal.
Which leads to a pretty profound conclusion. Maybe the real competitive edge in the future won't just be the fastest algorithm.
Right. The source suggests it belongs to the companies that genuinely lead with empathy. They won't just build tech that works. They'll build tech that earns trust. And in this increasingly skeptical age, trust is becoming the scarcest and therefore most valuable commodity.
So, wrapping this all up, synthesizing the core argument of our deep dive today. That final realization from the source material feels like the biggest takeaway. We aren't just building artificial intelligence to solve problems or process data. We are, quite literally, building the emotional infrastructure of the future.
That phrase really lands, doesn't it? Emotional infrastructure.
It does. Every algorithm, every interface, every automated choice we design, it actively shapes how people feel about living in a world increasingly driven by machines. That's a huge responsibility, far bigger than just hitting quarterly targets.
And the choice, as the material frames it, feels pretty stark and pretty urgent. We're basically at a crossroads. Path 1 leads to a future where AI treats humans mainly as problems to be solved, as data points to be optimized. That leads to cold, transactional, alienating interactions. Technology that makes us feel smaller, less human.
The dehumanizing path.
Right.
Oh.
Or Path 2, where we intentionally build systems that recognize the full, messy, complex reality of human experience.
Yeah.
Our anxieties, hopes, our need for dignity. That's the path towards AI that actually enhances our humanity, makes us feel more understood, more capable, more connected, not less. That's the real promise of designing with both code and compassion.
A much more hopeful vision.
Definitely. And so maybe the provocative thought to leave you, the listener, with is this. As you go about your day, interacting with all this tech, consider the trade-offs. If efficiency, pure speed, can be measured in milliseconds. But empathy, that careful human-centered design, takes time, takes effort, takes maybe slowing down development just a little bit. What kind of deep, fundamental shift needs to happen inside companies, especially big ones driven by quarterly results, for them to willingly accept that short-term cost of slowing down?
Yeah.
To invest that time for the huge long-term payoff of earning real, lasting human trust?
That intentional slowdown, that sacrifice for psychological value.
Yeah. That feels like the defining organizational challenge, maybe the leadership challenge for the next decade of technology.
Mhm.
Something worth thinking about.